Like Joey said, my name's Nathan Roueche. I'm with the Washington State Department of Agriculture Pest Program. I supervise our exotic wood-boring insect and bark beetle survey, along with a few others, and really appreciate being invited to talk at this event today. I also tend to run long, so I've really cropped down this presentation, and I may end up leaving plenty of time for questions. So, Chris, at the end, feel free to jump in if you have more than I do. Sounds like you have a good number to address. Just a quick outline what I'm going to be talking about here with the next 15 minutes or so is our program, our survey overview, detection methods, our target species, signs and symptoms, which is fantastic. Chris did a great job of building up to this. I'm really excited to be going after him. And then time for questions at the end. So this survey is part of the CAPS program. It's Washington's CAPS survey. CAPS is the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey. For the state of Washington, we use that CAPS funding for our exotic wood-boring insect and bark beetle survey. This is all funded by the U.S. Department of Agricultural Animal Plant Health Inspection Services. Hopefully that's the end of the acronyms, but I figured I'd get them out of the way at the start in case I slip some in just conversationally as we go. The goal of this survey is to protect both Washington and the nation's timber resources from exotic pests, with the key point being the targets of this survey are pests not currently known to be established within the United States. These target species and survey methods are standardized across all of the states to ensure comparable results and best practices between the various cooperating entities. For the survey, we generally target kind of in order of priority here from left to right, international shipping. So our major marine ports in Washington is of huge concern. The traps and visual surveys near these large marine ports are kind of our first line of detection once something moves outside of the vector, be that a wood product or packing material. We also focus on our land ports of entry, both domestic with other states as well as international borders with British Columbia and Canada. We tend to also trap pretty heavily near distribution centers, kind of following the vector along the pathway, with emphasis on the end location or distribution centers for these products. And kind of fascinatingly, some of these wood-boring insects can exist for many, many years, kind of in stasis in wood in some extreme situations before emerging. So anywhere that pallets build up or accrue is a potential risk to us. And we also occasionally will target green waste facilities with traps, visual surveys very frequently as well, kind of in the downstream monitoring. This won't give us a precise pinpoint of where within a county or a community we're likely to be experiencing some type of an introduction event, but much akin to epidemiological monitoring in wastewater. This gives us a sense of when something's going to be in a general area, as oftentimes these insects will result in dying trees, unsightly trees, drop limbs, things such as that may not even be noticed by the landowner or whoever's dealing with it and brought to a green waste facility and dropped off, where then the adult insects will emerge and seek a new host. So this is a statewide survey. As best as we can, we make it a statewide survey. We're about 4 field staff each year. So here's kind of it's a rough visual representation. Don't worry about reading those little the point labels for the different targets. But yeah, as you can see, from 2023, the trapping was predominantly focused around marine ports and really I-5 and then the gorge. But we try to get out and get into the communities in the east side of the state, even those that are often not thought of as in forested ecosystems. All communities are a forest, and a lot of those locations that weren't naturally a forest that now are a really vacant niche space waiting for a wood-boring insect to arrive, which makes them kind of uniquely prone to invasion as well. Generally domestic colonization in those locations, but invasives from overseas as well. And so this on the left is our trapping map. Traps will go out in the spring and be out until the fall, serviced every couple of weeks, which I'll detail again on a further slide. So we are really limited in the amount of time available to get to these traps and check them. but we can fill in with visual surveys for symptoms of wood borer damage in locations where we aren't able to run a trap in a given year, just to try to keep an eye throughout the state as best we can. As I mentioned, trapping is kind of half of our operation here. Generally, March through October is kind of the start and end with a rolling calendar of trap installs based on particular pests and weather. We are still getting our last few traps out now, so it can take a while to get them out, and then pull them at the end of the flight period at the end of each summer. Each target pest on the survey has a unique trap, lure, and host tree combination. As Chris mentioned, ethanol is a major component in almost every one of these lures, as well as additional more specific host volatiles, and in some cases where it's known, aggregation pheromones for reproduction specific to the species or more often the genre of the target pest. These traps mimic the bole of a tree in the eye and mind of a small insect, and the attracted insects attempt to land. And then you'll see these traps look like they're coated in something nasty. It's a fluon, like a really similar compound to Teflon, which makes it impossible for the insects to grip, and then they drop down into a collection cup at the bottom. I think an important thing to point out with the trapping operation is that unlike some other really specific types of trapping, say for spongy moth or Japanese beetle, this is a really broadly appealing lure generally, and there's nothing about them that don't also exist being produced naturally by the forests in which we place them. So this thing isn't really a tremendous magnet for all of the wood-boring insects that are around. They tend to give us something akin to a small scoop of what's flying around in that area. Anyway, the neighboring tree to this trap is still probably attracting vastly more wood-boring insects than the trap itself, but we're getting a pretty good idea of what's there. Following the trapping, the contents are collected every 2 weeks and brought back for the target and screened for targets in the WSDA entomology lab, or also sometimes in my living room. This is a cup that was brought in yesterday by our trapper, Kristen. She's in the call. She may recognize this one. It's pretty early, so we don't have a ton of things like longhorn beetles, but you can see there's a lot of ambrosia beetles in there. I haven't screened this thoroughly yet, but just based on the location and what we get, I would say that most, if not all of these, are going to be widely established exotics that Chris previously mentioned. So we identify all of the wood-boring insects and bark and ambrosia beetles to species, or occasionally to genus mostly just in the case of twig beetles, because there's a ton of them and none of them are targets, and they're almost impossible to differentiate morphologically. When we get a specimen that we suspect is a target or unable to determine isn't a target species, we then submit it to the USDA Aphis identification services, which will either be done morphologically by their taxonomists or genetically. In addition to the traps, we also conduct visual surveys, focus these in the high-risk areas of introduction and spread. There are some standard ones that are always going to be a high-risk location, but interceptions coming into the country by Customs and Border Protection and Aphis are also the general area where detections were bound for, are also forwarded to us monthly, so we get a sense of where there may be an ongoing situation in each given area. Host trees in these areas are inspected for wood-boring damage. The damage is cataloged, photographed. Whenever possible, we will try to determine on site what's causing it. There are a ton of native species as well, and it can be pretty difficult, if not impossible in some situations, to determine exactly what is causing that damage. In that case, where we see something suspicious but aren't able to find the smoking gun, so to speak, we'll often set traps in that area or mark it and return to try to determine what's causing it. And more often than not, that's always going to be, not always, excuse me, but more often than not, a native species. There's a ton of them out there, but we do keep an eye on that. And kind of going on to a couple of our survey targets, there are a lot of survey targets, and oftentimes in these presentations, I don't get to talk about our oaks, our oak obligate species, so I'm kind of excited to highlight two of them in this talk. Our survey targets longhorn beetles, jewel beetles, bark and ambrosia beetles, and wood wasps. And I have the number beneath these boxes correspond to how many target species we have in our survey this year. As you can see, it's predominantly longhorn beetles, a few jewel beetles, both agrylus species, a small handful of bark and ambrosia beetles with that asterisk there, meaning that there's also an additional weevil that is on the target list that I've lumped in here. And then we have no horntail wasps or wood wasps on our target list this year that we have in the past and likely will again in the future, and we do commonly encounter them in our trapping. Pardon me for a minute. So kind of our biggest threat always is the Asian and citrus longhorn beetles. These are incredibly devastating pests. They have a long history of introduction into the US, including into Washington and Tukwila in the mid-2000s. These are not specifically a pest of oak, but they're very aggressive in a wide range of deciduous hosts, and I couldn't not include them first in our target list. This is probably the biggest threat we have. Unfortunately, there's no known trapping method. They've not determined anything that they're attracted to. So we rely on visual detection for this species exclusively. And this damage is severe. It'll be really, really rapid decline of healthy trees, which is somewhat unique. Normally these things, as Chris mentioned previously, wood-boring insects generally target a stressed or weakened tree. Asian and citrus longhorn beetles, a kind of exception to the rule there. They have no problem absolutely decimating an otherwise healthy tree in the matter of a season or two. And the key thing to look for with these, aside from that really aggressive decline in deciduous hosts, would be a approximately dime-sized circular emergence hole. One that I've never gotten to talk about with folks, I'm excited to discuss here, is the kind of an oak ambrosia beetle. This is not a specific name. There are a number of species that would fall under this common name. Scientific name only would be Platypus quercivorus, which isn't as exciting as I thought. The platypus is just Greek for flatfoot, which I didn't realize. I had to wonder why on earth this thing was like a small aquatic marsupial. And quercivorus then being oak feeding. This is an ambrosia beetle. As mentioned previously, inoculates the host tree with a fungus, which the larvae and adults then feed on. It's native to East Asia and has expanded to neighboring countries within that range in recent years, where it's responsible or associated with pretty severe oak decline in this colonized range, predominantly in Japan. As previously mentioned, the specific science with this would be that sawdust-like fine frass from the adult attack into the tree, as well as the formation of the frass noodles extending from the gallery entrance as the adults clear out those chambers. We also have an agrylus species very similar to emerald ash borer, which is on our target list. It's native to Western Eurasia and is a congener of emerald ash borer. However, instead of being obligate in ashes, it is an obligate pest of oaks, which is unfortunate, just based on what EAB has done. Kind of assume that damage could be very similar in oaks if oak splendor beetle were to arrive. Fortunately, there are no known North American introductions at this time. There is some not great news with it. As mentioned, the EAB is kind of notoriously difficult to detect in low densities. Often it's found when the populations are well established in the location and starting to inflict pretty severe damage in ashes. So it's potential that this could have a similar impact in our oak communities, which is kind of some good news that the public is generally very aware at this point of keeping an eye out for the signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer. So this will be a really easy thing for that knowledge and awareness to transfer for folks to keep an eye out. Also pretty similar at a distance, sounds like, to Mediterranean oak borer. And then linking this to MOB, which is really bad news and has me really concerned at this point, and really focused on these areas where MOB seems to be arriving, or similar areas in Washington. Seems to be an undetermined and new pathway for oak pests with MOB, at least from the endemic region of Europe to the West Coast, which is Definitely a potential similar threat to this oak splendor beetle, although it hasn't had any history of known introduction to North America. However, MOB is getting here. I suspect it's likely also a perfectly viable pathway of introduction for this oak splendor beetle. Onto our visual surveys with the kind of broad signs and symptoms we look for. Chris did a really good job of highlighting, particularly with the ambrosia beetle, so I may skim over that just a little bit. But signs and symptoms with longhorn beetles. These adult exit holes are generally larger, although there are some pretty small longhorn beetles as well. The dime-sized holes are our biggest red flag for that Asian and citrus longhorn beetle. The galleries and frass, unique to these and jewel beetles as well, unlike the bark and ambrosia beetles, is that the adults are only ever emerging from the tree. The females oviposit into the bark, and the adults don't enter the tree. It's exclusively development within the tree, unlike the bark and ambrosia beetles, where the adults attack and make the galleries and chambers. There should only be larvae, pupae, or soon to emerge adults within the tree itself. As with most wood-boring insects, often what is noticed first would be crown dieback. Excuse me, my little video section here is covering this next one. And then kind of unique to longhorn beetles, particularly with the Asian and citrus longhorn beetles, the feeding and egg-laying injury, the females chew into the bark to get through that kind of outer defense of the tree and to lay their eggs within the inner bark. So you see these chew marks on trees being associated with a new introduced attack from these species.
Hey Nathan, you have about 3 minutes left.
Cool, perfect. Thank you. So signs and symptoms of jewel beetles. A lot of this is really known from EAB, really transferable from emerald ash borer to our oak splendor beetle. Main thing being these zigzagging galleries and the D-shaped exit holes. So everything transfers straight from EAB to oak splendor beetle in this instance. And I can skip through the signs and symptoms of bark and ambrosia beetle attack. The only thing I'd like to highlight that's different from what Chris presented on the ambrosia beetles is that with bark beetles, they're usually just inside the inner layer rather than boring into the wood itself. Thus, bark versus ambrosia beetles, that title, but everything else really applies. And so to wrap up with this survey and how it applies to Mediterranean oak borer, Mediterranean oak borer is not currently a USDA APHIS designated target species. But I want to highlight that what we're doing for this survey for the designated target species are the exact same traps and lures and visual survey efforts that we would use if we were. So they're likely to be encountered within our trap screening and our placement, and that we are placing traps in the areas we think MOB would be most likely to introduce in Washington, as it's a completely viable pathway, almost certainly for our other oak target pests. And wrap up here, if anyone has any questions, here's my email contact. Feel free to reach out to me directly or the pest program with WSDA as well.